I'm super excited to be here today. As Deborah had mentioned, I'm from the YWCA of Rochester and Monroe County, and our organization spent the last 5 years of our strategic plan focusing on best practices. And when we first got started, we first talked about, we introduced competencies on person-centered practices, motivational interviewing, and peer-related services. And we did that because we felt it was an investment in our organization because the funding climate had become so volatile. And we wanted to make sure that we were positioned to be able to continue to receive funding, but also to prove that we were doing work that made a difference. So we spent 5 years doing this work, and we were hoping that we were going to have much better outcomes. And what we found was that the trends started to change. We were shifting away from serving a lot of single women and started to see the number of families skyrocket. And we couldn't figure out why a lot of these families kept coming back into the shelter system. We have a full continuum of housing. So we have emergency housing, transitional housing, we have OASIS licensed programs, we have SROs, we have affordable housing, off-site, we have a full gamut of housing. But particularly for those families and women that were coming through the doors in emergency housing, transitional housing, without having the support services after they left, they would quickly come back through. And we started to analyze that. Because we had introduced peer services, we started to engage a lot of individuals in decision-making, policy-making. They started to trust us and tell us that we were missing the boat on trauma-informed services, meaning that we didn't truly recognize trauma. And by not recognizing it, we didn't get the adequate supports in place for them to be able to successfully make a transition and feel fully supported. And we're like, wow. We just invested 5 years in all this competency development, and we missed the boat because we didn't do trauma training and competency building with our staff and our organization. So we really set the tone in our organization to have sort of a higher up investment from starting with the board of directors. And it really infused in our entire organization because the goal was to really create a different culture at the organization. So I did create a PowerPoint. Did everybody see the PowerPoint in the back of the room? Because I'm going to reference a couple of things that we did as an organization. If you haven't gotten it, looks like. Okay. Thanks, Steve. So I talked about how we saw a trend in more families coming into the organization. So it kind of, we were all, as a community, working towards more housing first. But the housing first model was really designed for a lot, really the single family or single individuals. It really didn't talk about the holistic needs of families. And so that was really important for us to understand. We saw a lot more women coming in with past trauma and domestic violence. So it was important for us to recognize that. So in the handout, I have 10 minutes. So trauma-informed care is something that I took 5 years to learn how to do, and I'm going to try to summarize the best I can. 6 minutes, 34 seconds. Thank you. No pressure. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot about what trauma is, but in your handout, there's a brief summary. Basically, trauma refers to an intense and overwhelming experience that involves serious loss, threat, or harm to a person's physical and emotional well-being. And the reason it's important to be trauma-informed is if we don't recognize that somebody's past trauma can impact the way that their future pans out, we can really be doing some serious harm. Not only that, when we operate in our services or provide services, often we have practices that are re-traumatizing. And that was really hard for me to hear because, as Deborah said, I've been doing this work for 20 years. I was formerly homeless. I thought that I knew this. I thought that I knew what it was like to be person-centered. And it was really until I started to dig into this and start to develop my own competencies that I realized, oh my God, I have a lot to learn. And most of us have been trained in the old medical model way of doing business. A lot of the practitioners that are out there, service providers, worked and still continue to work from a deficit-driven model of service delivery. We focus on what are the barriers that somebody has, what are the deficits. Oh, well, tell me about that past trauma. And by doing that, we are reliving that trauma for an individual. So we needed to rethink how we were doing business. A lot of times, people who have experienced traumatic life events are often very sensitive to situations that remind them of the people, places, and things involved in their traumatic event. I had a young woman that was one of our peer advisors tell me that when she came into the homeless system, she had to tell her story 17 times. This was a woman that was so severely beaten that she had metal plates put in her head and was in an induced coma for 3 months. When she finally got out of that coma, she was her child was reacclimated with her. He was 4 at the time, so developmentally, every time she told that story, he heard it. And in a child that age, they think it's a separate incident. So he, in the system, we were talking about this, Mary and I, in the youth system, they set up a system so that the child only has to tell their story once to all the providers so that that child is not re-traumatized. In the housing world and in adult services, we don't do that. So she said that when she first came in, she had to tell the police officer, she had to tell the special units victim police officer, she had to tell the admitting person at the hospital her story, what had happened to her. She had to tell another nurse, doctors. Then she went into the court system and had to tell her story a million times over, and then into the housing system. All the time, nobody was sensitive enough to take that child out of the room. Because in the system, we try so hard to get somebody into emergency housing or housing services. We are not mindful of that. So it was really helpful for me to hear that story because it helped us recognize that we have to think about systems. So when you're trauma-informed, we have to consider all aspects of service delivery in order to provide services that are safe, empowering, and not re-traumatizing. That includes your physical environment, your policies, language, practices, HR functions, all of that. And it takes several years to figure all this out. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that the YWCA did that helped us get to the place where we are becoming more trauma-informed. First off, competency development. I said, I've been doing this work for 20 years. I am fortunate. I have a very dedicated staff. We rarely see turnover. The staff that have been with me have been there for years. They never had competency development around trauma-informed services. We actually contracted with a local university, University of Buffalo, that had a trauma certification program. They tailored something for our organization that was around housing services because we're not clinical providers. So our staff had to have 5 days of intensive training just to build the foundation to even understand what trauma was. And it was mind-blowing. We had no idea how complex trauma was and the biological changes. And we see women, I reference women because I'm from the Y, but you get women that come in and they're angry and they're sad, and oftentimes staff will say, oh, they're not motivated. Oh, they're just pissed off at the rules. Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, they're traumatized. 60% of the women that come into my front door identify as being trauma survivors. Oftentimes, that information doesn't come out until far after you establish a relationship with somebody. So I know the number is much higher. So the other thing is that by involving peers who have experienced trauma, boy, they'll tell. They'll tell on your organization if you give them the chance and give them a safe forum to do it. So by including peers and individuals that have received services to be part of policy making, the people that live in our organization hire our staff. They developed our policies. They serve on our board of directors. They are my personal advisor because I'll tell you, I never in a million years would have recognized all the things that we were doing that was so harmful. So if you have the opportunity to involve peers in your organizations, I highly recommend it. We changed the mentality around rules. We had dozens of rules, dozens and dozens of rules. And we all said it was because we needed them in order to function. Well, guess what? We got rid of all the rules, and we function way better. Mm-hmm. We have 2 hard and fast rules, and it's all about just safety and harm. No weapons in the organization, but a lot of women do come in with weapons, so we say that we'll keep it, we'll safeguard it, we'll give it back when you leave, and I think the other was just threatening and harmful behavior. All other rules are shared, the control is shared, and we negotiate everything that a person does when they come into the organization. Data sharing. We learned a lot from the woman that had to tell her story 17 times just to get in our front doors. So we are doing a lot more data sharing, and as a community, we are really working hard to do consolidated intakes and consolidated processes so that people don't have to retell their story. So there's big community-wide stuff that you can be doing, and I'm sure that your communities are doing it because HUD is really asking us to do it. Got it. Thank you. The other thing is not being so voyeuristic about the information that that people experience. We don't have to have a background about somebody's past trauma in order to forward think. We focus on wishes, desires, interests, passion. By virtue of moving towards that continuum, women will tell whether or not they've had past trauma, and that will help us guide the future or help them get the resources. And then we partner, when we recognize trauma, we immediately react and get clinicians that we trust to help that woman. So just in wrapping up, if you have, I feel like I could talk forever, and I talk fast, so I have the gift of gab. Steve will tell you that. In the back of your PowerPoint presentation, one of the things that we did to become trauma-informed was we set up challenges at our organization. We have challenges with the women that live there, and we have challenges with the staff. So they snap pictures of things that we have in our organization that are not trauma-informed. So there's a picture of a residence. How stark and ugly is that? I mean, if you were coming into our organization, would you want to stay? No. Rules. We have a TV room rules. The TV room is open from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. I don't know about you, but I can't start my day without my coffee first thing in the morning watching the news. It sets the stage for my day. We don't open up the TV room until 11 o'clock? What's that all about? We have one about a laundry schedule. We assigned rooms for a laundry schedule. I don't know if you can see it because it's tiny. What if you were a woman with 3 children and you work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, but you're assigned room 447? It says here on this chart you can only do laundry on Friday, but the laundry room closes at 5 o'clock on Friday. What the hell? Some of the pictures are really stark. One of the things that you'll see is there's a slide that says our attempt. We had a front foyer that was really ugly white. We painted it green, and you can't tell really by the picture, but it's kind of a mossy green. And we're like, yes, we're doing this. And then I had a woman come up to me, and she's like, Carrie, it's nice that you added color, but why did you have to pick the jailhouse color? I'm like, darn. So we'll be repainting the front foyer, right? And there's an example of, what we hope to really kind of get to is a room that's really welcoming and warm, and it welcomes somebody. So hopefully I'll be able to come back and we can talk a little bit more about this in depth, but I do need to turn it over because we have a lot to talk about.